this event tonight. Let's just continue to have the party. It's over. In the courtyard, everybody. No. It must be the vodka Les brought. I have a funny story. Many people don't know. I mean, Les and I go back a long time, and I'm not a big drinker, except when I'm with him. So that's why I have the vodka. Welcome, everybody, to Books and Books. Welcome to this amazing gathering with all good friends. I look out there and I see people that I've known for many, many, many years, and I'm so thrilled that you're here with us. I have to also say that since probably a couple times ago that Les was here, we've started live streaming lots of our events, almost all of our events. And much of it comes from a grant from the Knight Foundation, and we thank them. We also thank UA Media, who helps us do all of this. So you're liable to be on camera. So if you're sitting next to somebody you shouldn't be, you might want to move. Just a warning. And I steal that from Steve, who started that, who works with us over there. But this will be live streamed. You can see it again probably later tonight if you want. If you've asked a good question, that is. You'll want to do that. And I have to say, this is probably the 97th time we presented Les Standiford at Books and Books. And I don't know what the hell to say about him other than he's really just one of the greatest guys around. So what I thought I would do is just tell you a little bit about the book. How's that? Because we all know about Les, that he's written 20 novels, that he's the director of creative writing at FIU, that he's just a great guy, and we're just so happy to have him in our midst in South Florida. But this book couldn't, as we all know, be more timely. Les has a canny knack for doing that. As you've all read, California is about to go dry in the next little while. And this book, Water to the Angels, talks about William Mulholland and the building of the aqueduct and how Los Angeles got wet in the first place, which was through the good efforts of Mulholland. And I just want to tell you a couple of things just to let you know how forward-thinking Les is. A couple of weeks ago, we had Eric Larson here. And Eric Larson, we all went out afterwards for a drink, and Eric Larson led on to all of us sitting there that his book that he was going to write, his next book, was going to be on Mulholland. But when he heard that Les was doing it, he decided, forget it. And in fact, Eric Larson has written this really wonderful little blurb. And this is it. In this incredibly timely book, Les Standiford chronicles William Mulholland's heroic drive to bring water to Los Angeles and thus to create the city we know today. It's a powerful and beautifully told story of hubris, ingenuity, and ultimately deepest tragedy. That's from Eric Larson. The book page, which is another wonderful purveyor of reviews, talks about Les's new book, and he says, he goes on to talk a little bit about the book itself, but then it says, Standiford expertly weaves the internecine drama behind the building of the aqueduct with a modern inquiry into its legacy. And he even touches upon the movie Chinatown, which used the bones of the story but played fast and loose with the facts. Water to the Angel leaves little doubt that the forward-thinking Mulholland was as original as the city he birthed. And I can just tell you that those of us who have all read Last Train to Paradise and know what it's meant to all of us here in South Florida to learn about our history here, this book is already making waves in Los Angeles, and he's been on numerous shows on television there. I think he's heading out in the next couple of days to Los Angeles Book Fair. He's got a full host of events scheduled in L.A. So as Last Train to Paradise became the history of South Florida, I know Water to the Angels would become the history of California. So let's please give a warm, warm welcome to our buddy Les Standiford. Taking the vodka with you.
Yeah, we do. What a pleasure, and thank you for coming here tonight. I'm just a kid from the hills of southeastern Ohio. I actually took my wife Kimberly there shortly after we got married, and she spent a couple of days, and then in a private moment she said, "Wait a minute, did you really grow up here?" She's still looking for the mall in Cambridge, Ohio. So I've had the great good fortune to live in some very interesting places in South Florida, among them, and another, Southern California, where I went out of college. And I fell in love with the place. Never mind what Woody Allen says. I really felt like this was an amazing, magical place, and I wondered how it could have become. And I once heard Robert Towne say, shortly after Chinatown, which is one of my favorite films, came out, say, "I wish I could have told the real story of Chinatown because I thought that was as interesting as the stuff that we made up." And that comment stuck with me for so long, and when it came time to write another book here 4 years ago, when there was no drought, I will tell you, I decided to look into what made him say that, and, I decided the same thing. It was a fascinating story. And I was talking to a fellow today on the radio from out there, and he said, "Well, why is it that people don't talk about William Mulholland more? We know that there's a Mulholland Drive, but we don't know what he did." And part of it has to do with the myth of Chinatown, which suggests that the whole bringing of water to Los Angeles was a cynical, quasi-criminal cabal between business people and politicians that took place back in the 30s. But there's never been any evidence of that. In fact, some people did make large sums of money because they owned land in the San Fernando Valley or bought it when they learned the aqueduct was coming. But Mulholland was never involved with any of that. He never made a penny more than his $15,000 civil servant's salary at its zenith. And as he was fond of saying, "Well, show me a place to bring the water to Los Angeles where somebody doesn't own the land." And he decried the whole notion of people profiting off the idea of bringing water to the people. Bringing water to the people was the only thing that mattered to him. I wanted to start with just a little bit, a little piece from the book to give you some idea of how I write about history. When I was in school, history was presented to me largely as a series of names and dates to be remembered. And the minute the test was over, that was it. It all flew out of my head. And to this day, I know that 1066, as years ago, is way more important than 1067 or 1065. But I don't know why. And if you told me, I would forget by the time we got to the parking lot. But what I did remember were stories from history, narratives from history, whether they were mythic or true. Alexander presented with the riddle of the Gordian knot, "The man who shall untangle this knot will rule the empire." And he said, "I've got it," pulled out his sword and cleaved the thing in half. That was an untangling for you. And the story of British and German troops one night on Christmas Eve early on in the conflict in World War I, stopping their hostilities in order to sing carols to one another back and forth in their trenches in the frozen lines of France. Those things stick with me, the human parts of history, and they make me want to remember the names and the dates. And, well, anyway. In May of 1912, there were about 2,000 men busy along the entire line of the Los Angeles Aqueduct's construction, doing perilous work in the siphons and tunnels in the Saugus and Jawbone and Grapevine divisions, where they had been lucky to escape without serious mishap to that point. It was a surprising run of luck, in fact, given the nature of the work and the terrain. But then again, good fortune is only known by what opposes it. On the morning of June 16th, in the Drinkwater Tunnel in the San Gabriel Mountains, about 15 miles north of Saugus, there were about 20 men at work in the southern half of a 5,600-foot shaft known officially as Tunnel Number 9. A little before 8 a.m., Foreman Lewis Gray led a blasting crew of 3 others to a point about 2,200 feet inside the mountain. There were about 400 feet of rock separating Gray's crew from the men working down from the opposite end, and they were scheduled to break through on July 1st, assuming nothing unforeseen took place. At the blasting site, Gray went over the task at hand with the crew. They were to place 50 pounds of dynamite in holes that had already been prepared, apply the priming powder and caps to the charges, and run the fuses in readiness for the blast itself. It was nothing the men, shift boss Norman Stoble, tool nipper Thomas O'Donnell, and rock train man Edward Garside hadn't done any number of times, but still Gray left them with an admonition: be careful. Gray couldn't be sure what happened after he rounded a curve that hid the men from his sight. There was electric light in the tunnel, and even if the lines didn't run right up to the spot where the trio was working, there was plenty of light there to work by. Still, Gray knew, miners were creatures of habit. Though it was absolutely forbidden, the men liked to carry their candles and often used them to supplement the electric lights. Or maybe it was just a spark thrown as someone crimped a cap on a charge. All Gray knew for sure was that less than 5 minutes after he'd left the group, and as he was still making his way toward the mouth of the tunnel, he heard a tremendous roar. In the next instant, he was flying through darkness, then slammed into a wall of rock. He was bleeding, stunned by the force of the blast, and barely able to breathe the air that was filled with dust and fumes. Still, he forced himself to crawl toward what he hoped was light. To stay where he was would mean death. The men he'd left behind were not as fortunate. Stoble and O'Donnell had been working together a few feet away from Garside, who himself was only inches from the charges at the head of the tunnel when the blast went off. The bodies of Stoble and O'Donnell were eventually found buried beneath the 40 carloads of granite that came down in the cave-in caused by the blast. There was nothing left of Garside. Most of the other members of the shift working closer to the mouth of the tunnel felt the blast and had hardly turned to run when the lights went out and the roof came down, jamming the passageway, 12 feet wide and 13 feet high, before them. As they tore at the pile of rock, Foreman Gray emerged, bloody and battered, from the cloud of dust and the fumes at their heels. He told them what had happened, ignoring his injuries to join in the task of dislodging the jumble until finally, heads splitting from the effects of the fumes, they could see light and could crawl and stagger forward and were out of the tunnel and able to breathe at last. The survivors were soon joined by 100 other members of the work camp hurrying back inside to search for survivors. Deep inside, they found a half a dozen men who had turned the wrong way in the darkness and in confusion. Instead of escaping the fumes, they had run deeper into them, and by the time they realized their mistake, they were too weak to go on. In time, the bodies of Stoble and O'Donnell were uncovered from the muck. Although O'Donnell's clothing had been blown from his body by the explosion's force, a man found his watch nearby, the hand still. In that manner, the time of the blast was determined. Lewis Gray was the son of John Gray, chief engineer of the division where the blast had taken place. O'Donnell had come up from San Bernardino, grateful to have found work. As for Garside, not only had his corporeal being vanished, no details of a family or a past could be ascertained. It was the worst accident to strike the project in its time. There was one footnote to the tragedy worth mentioning. In the aftermath, as bodies were being carried off and the injured tended to, one of the rescuers heard a strange sound issuing from the mouth of the tunnel. He walked closer, then turned to a companion. "It's Maud," he said, and soon members of the crew were dashing back inside the tunnel behind him. Maud was the miner's pet mule, part of the original four-legged crew that pulled the muck-laden cars out of the tunnel before the arrival of electricity rendered her an anachronism. The miners, though, had made a favorite of the even-tempered and tireless Maud. They allowed the mule, who often had to be forced out of the tunnel at the end of a shift, to keep on working. She had been back inside the shaft that day, patiently awaiting the resumption of her duties when the blast came and knocked her unconscious. In the darkness and confusion, rescuers had forgotten about Maud until they heard her braying. Finally, they found her deep inside the passage, bruised and filthy, but otherwise intact. When the men tried to lead her out of the tunnel, however, Maud splayed her legs in the fashion of her kind and would not budge. The men had to bring food and water down to her until the car line could be cleared and Maud herself could be hauled back to the top. So that's the kind of stuff that makes these moments of history, important as they may be, and this is certainly an important one. William Mulholland was the father of Los Angeles. If it hadn't been for what he did between 1907 and 1913, for all we know, Los Angeles could be just another attractive but smallish outpost somewhere along the Southern California coast. It's arid country. It was never meant to support a city of 10 million people. Let me shift gears here for a moment. Some of you have heard this trope before, but I can't resist. I used to believe that if you were lucky enough to have written a book and found a publisher for it, then what you did was retire to your chambers and write another book. But I discovered that is not how it works. The publisher expects you to go out and help sell the thing. And it is not that I mind coming to nice places like this and meeting folks such as yourself who have an interest in what it is that I do, but sometimes it goes even further than that. When the first of these narrative histories, as I refer to them, was being prepared for publication, Last Train to Paradise, I got a call from the publicist at Random House. Brandon Perlberg was his name, and Brandon said, "Les, good news. There's a chance we can get you on one of the morning news programs with this book." And I said, "Great, Brandon." And then he said, "But." And you come to understand there's always a but with these things. I said, "Well, what is it, Brandon?" He said, "Well, they want a news angle." I said, "A news angle? All the stuff in this book happened more than a century ago." He said, "Yes, but it's a news show and they need a news angle, so go to work on it and get back to me when you come up with one." So what I did then was retire to my chambers and try to come up with a news angle regarding stuff that had happened about 100 years ago. And to tell you the truth, I just couldn't do it. But I was bound and determined to prove that given half a chance, I could have an interesting conversation with Charlie Gibson, because by then they'd let it be known that this was who we were talking about in the show Good Morning America. He was then the anchor. He was a reader. He liked to have writers on. They were always fascinating conversations to me, and I wanted to show them that it would work, news angle or not. Well, the truth is, it never did work, but I was so happy with the way that fictitious interview turned out that I took it with me everywhere I went on the book tour, and I've been doing the same thing ever since. Always hoping, but nonetheless, I thought if I would ask you to lend me that time-honored favor of the suspension of your disbelief, and imagine that I'm surrounded by a big television screen up here, and the Depends commercial has just faded softly away, and we've forgotten about whatever the new iteration of Bruce Jenner is going to be. The next voice you hear will be that of Charles Gibson, still an anchorman, still reading books, and still interviewing intrepid authors. As temperatures continue to rise in Los Angeles, a record 103 degrees this past September, and wildfires envelop more residential property, the prospect of a serious long-term drought becomes more likely. There were storms in February that dumped several inches of water on the ground, but the real source of year-round water in the region comes from the Sierra Nevada snowpack, and there has not been enough snow this winter to replenish that source, about a third of normal. That was only yielding about 10% of its of runoff last summer. Governor Jerry Brown has in fact just issued the first mandatory water use restrictions ever for the entire state. While the water crisis in California heightens, a new book takes readers on a journey to the early years of the 20th century when Los Angeles, then a dusty outpost, first began to grapple with the question of how to keep from drying up into oblivion. With us here to share the story of how California has responded to their first brush with drought's catastrophe is Les Standiford, author of Water to the Angels, William Mulholland, his monumental aqueduct, and the rise of Los Angeles. And here we have the great reason to become an author, because if you're not happy with how your reality is going, you just redo it. Question, or should I say Charlie? Les, you wrote 10 novels before you turned to writing these recent works of nonfiction. What drew you away from making it all up into history? Answer, well, Charlie, these true stories I've been telling seem to me just as good as anything I might have made up. And in fact, if you'd actually had me on your show back when Last Train to Paradise came out, you'd remember what I told you then. One of the richest men in the world undertakes the engineering challenge of the century, and the worst hurricane in history wipes it all away. That seemed to me to be a lot more interesting story than one about how a financial advisor steals all the stockholders' money and builds himself a really big house. In the present case, there are some significant parallels to Last Train to Paradise. William Mulholland, a penniless Irish immigrant who'd never gone to high school, much less taken any coursework in engineering, designed and built the impossible Los Angeles aqueduct between 1907 and 1913, moving an entire river from the mountains of central California 233 miles southward to Los Angeles, over deserts and across chasms and through more mountains. Los Angeles had about 100,000 people at the time that Mulholland began his work and had been in the grip of a drought for a dozen years or so. The place was tapped out in terms of water and seemed destined to stay just one more dusty town along the coast until Mulholland brought the water. Today, of course, Los Angeles has become one of the prominent cities in the world with 10 million or more living in its basin. Question. Well, if Mulholland pulled that off, why aren't we more familiar with him today? Answer. That's a real good question, Charlie. Of course, a lot of people know Mulholland Drive, the spectacular road that runs along the crest of the Hollywood Hills, and there's actually a Mulholland Middle School in L.A. and a water pumping station and some other things, but you're right in that Mulholland himself doesn't get a lot of press these days. Part of it has to do with what I call the myth of Chinatown. Question. You're talking about the Academy Award-winning film that stars Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway? Answer. It is a classic and one of my favorites. And the film uses what are sometimes called the California Water Wars as an historical backdrop. But in that movie, the fictional character of Water Commissioner Hollis Mulwray is a stand-in for William Mulholland, and that character is portrayed as a colorless pipsqueak who was easily done in by powerful bad guy developer Noah Cross, played by John Huston. So far as the real history of LA is concerned, though, the film doesn't have much correspondence to what really happened. I like to say that it has about as much relation to the facts as Donald Duck has to ducks, but Chinatown is set in the 1930s, for one thing. Mulholland did the bulk of his work between 1905 and 1915. And while the subplot of the movie suggests that there was a big conspiracy between businessmen such as Noah Cross and the city to build the aqueduct and line the pockets of the corrupt, there is no evidence, none that's ever been uncovered to support such charges. Question. Mulholland was never accused of taking a bribe. Answer, he was honest to a fault. All he ever got out of building the aqueduct was his civil servant salary, which was bumped up to $15,000 a year as he was doing that work. Politicians came to him in the aftermath of the aqueduct's completion and asked him to run for mayor. He was the most popular individual in Los Angeles in 1913 and could have won in a walk. His response was typical Mulholland, though. Mayor, I'd rather give birth to a porcupine backward. He was not much for politics. Harrison Gray Otis, publisher of the Los Angeles Times, his son-in-law Harry Chandler, a developer named Moses Sherman, and others did buy up property in the San Fernando Valley in advance of the aqueduct's completion, and they did profit. But that had nothing to do with William Mulholland. He decried such speculation, but as he also said, show me a place to bring the water where someone doesn't already own the land. All Mulholland cared about was bringing water to the people and to a place he had fallen in love with. He came to Los Angeles and started work as a ditch digger in the 1870s when there were only a few thousand residents and disputes were still being resolved by shootouts in the streets. He worked himself up to become the superintendent of the private company that sold the city its water, and when the city bought the company out, they brought Mulholland with it, the brains of the outfit, as everyone knew. Charlie. So where did the idea come from, diverting the Owens River from all the way up by the Mammoth Ski area east of San Francisco? Answer, Mulholland gave credit to a former mayor of Los Angeles, Fred Eaton, who had floated the idea of using Owens Valley water to irrigate lands down by Mojave, China Lake, not far from Death Valley, as early as 1892. But until Mulholland and Eaton took a legendary buckboard trip up into the Sierras and Mulholland pronounced the concept feasible, no one took the idea seriously. It would be like Washington, D.C. tapping into the Ohio River for its drinking water, one federal water engineer said. Question. So the project wasn't an easy sell for Mulholland? Answer, just the opposite. A lot of people thought it could not be done, and others believed the price tag of $23 million was too high. But Mulholland had turned the city's water company into a money-making concern that delivered what it promised. In the end, voters were won over by the chief, as he was known. The truth is that Mulholland had that same larger-than-life and engaging persona that bad guy Noah Cross projects in the movie Chinatown. It is just that Mulholland was honest and greatly loved. Question. How did the actual building of the aqueduct go? Answer. Such a thing had never been done before, and all the work took place in terra incognita. It was hard to keep laborers going, and the physical challenges were unprecedented. Mulholland admitted once, without whiskey, we would never have finished. But he also came up with a number of novel engineering techniques that had never been thought of, including the construction of massive steel siphons, 80 to 100-inch in diameter sections of pipe that carried the waters miles down one side of a huge canyon and up the next, all without pumps. There are no pumps on the 233-mile route. Only gravity moves the water because pumping would have been entirely cost prohibitive. And Mulholland laid out the entire route using a surveyor's compass and a barometer. In the end, and though there were a number of casualties, the work came in on time and under budget, using a crew made up entirely of city employees, largely due to Mulholland's tireless effort. Just imagine, somebody announces the largest civil engineering project in history, says, I'm going to use all city employees, and I'm going to bring it in on time and under budget. Charlie. You'd call him a hero, I'm guessing. Answer. I'd call him larger than life, that's for certain, but there is a tragic turn to Mulholland's story. In 1928, the St. Francis Dam that he designed and built in 1926 to store aqueduct waters burst. The flood sent a wall of water some 60 miles all the way to the Pacific Ocean and killed more than 600 people. It remains today one of the worst disasters in California history, second only to the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. At the coroner's inquest called to assign blame, Mulholland, then 72, said this: "If human error was involved, then I'm the human. Fasten the blame on me." That's a rare stance for a public official then and now, but that is the kind of man he was. In the end, no blame was assigned to any individual, and engineering experts debate the cause of the dam's collapse to this day. Question: so what is the legacy of William Mulholland then? Answer: that he, a self-trained engineer motivated by what he felt was best for those around him, designed and completed a project that changed the world to an extent that could scarcely be imagined at the time. His example of ingenuity, selflessness, dedication, and achievement is about as grand as it gets. Question: if he were around today, what question might you ask him? Answer: I'd ask, "Mr. Mulholland, we're about to run out of water in California again. What do you think we ought to do?" Charlie: I wish he were here to answer. Thanks for being on the show, Les. I wish we'd had you on here a whole lot sooner. My pleasure, Charlie. Well, I've brought a little show and the incessant flow of people into the region, something which, by the way, we here in South Florida face ourselves. We've been under water restrictions here for 4 years, and listen, we might be doing all right now, but we don't know when the 4-year drought hits us. Climate change looms, no matter what they say up or don't say up in Tallahassee. Here's the map of the aqueduct, and it shows you toward the top. You're almost up there. Mono Lake is almost to the California line, about 250 miles north of California, and there's the line of the aqueduct all the way down to Los Angeles. And that's how Los Angeles used to get its water, out of the LA River, a stream that was projected to be able to allow some 100,000 to 200,000 people at the max to survive. They used that water wheel, raised it up to that conduit, and then gravity from there fed most of the pipes. That's what LA looked like around the turn of the 20th century. I think there's another shot here. It gives you there's downtown LA at the time. Next. Here's the aqueduct up in the Owens Valley. The snow, that's the Sierra Nevada off there to the right. This is a beautiful place. It's one of the steepest valleys in the entire world. They have the White Mountains on the east side, the Sierra Nevadas on the west. It gets the valley is so deep that it starts to be twilight around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Just an amazing place, but gorgeous. Next. There are some of the guys building part of the lined aqueduct. This was an assemblage of open canal, then lined aqueduct like you have here, then siphons and pipes and tunnels. That's just another work. That's an idea of how desolate it was. That's somewhere in the Owens Valley. Another chunk of the aqueduct is after it had been poured. That's the Owens Lake there in the background, which was a dead-end lake, blocked by an earthquake eons ago, and all this water from the Owens River would flow into that Owens Lake. Then it would percolate all summer long, and most of the water would evaporate in the heat, which was over 100 degrees there, and there were great salt deposits. A very saline lake, and wasn't much use for recreation. Birds liked it. It was a stopover for particularly for saltwater birds, but that's what gave Fred Eaton the idea that if we could knock out that ages-old earthquake and let that water flow on, this thing could be a lifesaver. This is Mulholland's favorite machinery, hay burners, and he called them. He was a great cost accountant. He could figure to the penny what it took to drive a rivet into pipe, 21 cents for a small one, up to $5 for some of these large ones. And he could calculate how far a mule could pull a wagon per bale of hay. And he did this all the time. And if things got out of hand, he wanted to know why. He loved mules at first. One of the few pieces of mechanized equipment that he had work on this were the steam shovels, and he did like them. He enjoyed watching steam shovels work, and so did other people because they were kind of a novelty at the time. And the project also featured the first real use, substantial use of the Caterpillar tractor, which today is a fixture of heavy equipment. But there's one at work. And what do we have here? Oh, that's one of the tunnels where the pipe, kind of phallic here, the pipe comes out of the side of one of those chasms. All right, let's get that off there. Here's the Jawbone Siphon. This is one of these great pipes where the water rushes down this side of the canyon, goes across the floor, and then goes up that next hillside, powered only by gravity, because they step down the pipe as the size of the pipe as it goes down the side of the canyon, and the pressure forces the water along enough to get it to go all the way up the other side. And this was Mulholland that came up with this concept. That's the Jawbone Siphon, which you can stand up there and see that same view. And it's kind of amazing in such an elemental landscape to look at that, what man did, and look at the land, which is pretty much unchanged since, well, I don't know, the beginning of time, basically, and see that juxtaposed one against the other. It really struck me, and one of the reasons that I'm so caught up by this book. Here they are building. This is a pipe that I think goes across the north end of the San Fernando Valley from the reservoir that the water created, headed toward, finally, customers in L.A. This is a photo that's labeled, captioned in the book, "Maybe Mod." We're not sure, but this is how they moved all the rock out of the tunnels. Here they are. These guys, a couple of these guys here, a wonderful photograph. They're coating the inside of the pipe with a kind of paint to keep it from corroding, and it was a very dangerous process because fumes would build up inside the pipe, and if you weren't careful, as did happen, there were explosions, and that'd be the end of you. I talk about an instance or two of that in the book. It was pretty tough stuff. But men, by and large, enjoyed working underground more than they did on the surface, where the wind always blew and the temperatures were either freezing or hot. At least underground, the temperature stayed constant, and despite that danger, none of them ever thought that it was going to happen to them. There's something wrong with it. This is a pipe that collapsed because the water ran out of it, and so gravity made the water collapse. They thought, oh my God, this is a 6-mile section of very expensive pipe. What are we going to do? Mulholland said, don't worry. We're going to fix the leak, and then once we've got the leak patched, we're going to put water into the pipe again. And the pressure of the water forced the pipe back into position. And what looked like to be a colossal blow went away. And that's the restored pipe. It's going across the Antelope Valley there, north of L.A. Here they are diverting the water from this. In the background is the Owens River itself, and here is the canal. That's the headwaters of the L.A. Aqueduct. And here it is at the other end. This is just, you can see this up by where the I-5 goes over the pass right by Saugus, Newhall. into the into the Santa Clarita Valley, you can look over and see what Mulholland liked to call the Cascades. Sometimes still runs, although not recently. Here is Mulholland at the dedication in 1913, giving the water to the people, saying, his famous line is, "There it is, take it." And when they did a reenactment in 2013 in Jerry Brown, or Eric, the current mayor of Los Angeles, what's his name? Garcetti said, "There it is, conserve it." Here is an example. This was always a thorn in the side of the residents of the Owens Valley. No one, of course, they originally wanted their water to be used for a Bureau of Reclamation project in the Owens Valley that would have grown vast amounts of alfalfa. Los Angeles wanted the water to allow it to grow. The matter was finally brought before President Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "Alfalfa in the Owens Valley, great city on the coast in the Southland." His comment was, "It will be 100-fold, nay, 1,000-fold more valuable if the water is carried to Los Angeles than used by the citizens of the Owens Valley." And the matter was decided. But that certainly was not met with great favor there, and acts of sabotage have taken place, well, constantly since. One of the librarians up there in Bishop told me that, or Lone Pine, told me that rangers who come in to borrow books are always saying, "We found a water gate that had been opened up today, turning water out onto the valley floor." This was the result of a dynamiting of a pipe in the Owens Valley in 1926. And the pipe was, the gates were occupied. The entire flow of the aqueduct turned out into the desert at one point. You can't see very well there. It's not a great picture. But the end of Mulholland's career came in 1928. He had built some impoundment reservoirs in Southern California in the hills. This one in the just above the Santa Clarita Valley, not far from Saugus, Newhall. This is the St. Francis Dam. It was constructed to conserve water coming from the aqueduct, save it for non-rainy days. And there were 8 of these built in the region. This in 1926. It took 2 years to fill. And there it is, just as the waters were lapping at the top of it. And in 1928, it collapsed and created that flood that I mentioned before. That's all that was left of it, that little chunk. I don't know why some of these photos are showing up so small, but let's see if we can get the next one. Here are some of the people downstream trying to, coming through the wreckage after. This is the power plant that was right below the dam that you saw. That's all that was left of it, these big dynamos. And here's Mulholland with his driver at the site shortly thereafter. He was 72 years old at the time and still the water superintendent. That's a map that gives you some sense of the size and the vastness of this is the watershed of the Los Angeles River, which begins out here in the valley, flows down here and comes around, empties into the ocean near Long Beach. That's the Owens River as it looks today, the headwaters of it, and much as it did when Mulholland saw it. That's the Owens Lake, which is pretty dry. Before, that water would have been way up here. There is a little bit of water left, but it's very salty now. Big salt flats surround it. There are dust storms that are pretty bad these days. The Department of Water and Power spent a lot of money trying to create at least marshlands around there to mitigate some of the air quality issue. There's the Los Angeles River. If some of you have seen this, the Los Angeles River today is mostly known as a movie set. Cops chase people with bad guys up and down the canal. it only runs really when there's a flood, and because they try, even with the floods, they try to conserve the water to block it and get it to soak into the aquifer. But there needs to be some place for the water to go in case of the gully washers that sometimes occur out there. These are the penstocks, or the pipes. That's the cascades. Right, you can see this if you're driving up the 5 and you're heading over into the Santa Clarita Valley, Los Angeles down here. These are the cascades, the water of the original aqueduct and a second parallel aqueduct built in the 70s right beside it. This is Mulholland Dam, which still exists. It's really a copy of the St. Francis Dam that collapsed. It's a beautiful place. It's in the Hollywood Hills. Not to frighten anyone in Hollywood, but it's been strengthened since that collapse. And no one really knows why the original collapse took place. They still debate it. At any rate, this dam still exists, still provides water to Angelenos, and it's a gorgeous place to hike around, as my wife knows, and friends of ours. Wonderful place. There's the Mulholland Memorial Fountain up in Los Feliz. What else do we have? There's the view that got me entranced by this place to begin with and made me ask that question, how did all this come to be? There's the crowd that came to witness the bringing of the water to Los Angeles back in 1913. It's out of position because I couldn't fix it. And another view of the Owens Valley today. I mean, such in my mind, such an amazing antipodal situation here between this place, this beautiful, gorgeous place, and this amazing developed city connected by this umbilical cord of water. And it's beyond me to say what's right in this situation, truly. But all I know is that I was fascinated to tell the story of how this water came from there to create this city. Whether or not it's sustainable, we don't know. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for coming out tonight. One thing before we get to the questions, I want to say that the photographer, the artist who took the artist photograph for the book, Gary Kravitz, is here tonight. Where are you, Gary? There, standing right over there with his camera. Thank you. I love this photo, and as a result, as a spin-off of the photo, he's not only a photographer, he is a painter and an artist. So he said, you know what, I got motivated to do something as a result of taking that photograph. Okay. How cool is that? Hey.
I like the martini.
Yeah, I think we'll hang this up over the bed, honey. And
How about the ceiling? Any questions? One second, let me come in so you...
Les, you have such a command of the subject matter. And what I'd like to know is, when you're writing, do you get obsessed with it so that you can't, put it down out of your head? It takes you several years to do this. Or can you walk away like you do from work? Or
Well, thank you for that question. I tell my students, unless you're living in the moment that you're writing about, I don't think the material is going to be any good. And my approach to history is not to write names and dates, but to try to recreate what it was like to be the people at the time. And I would be entranced. I learned so much in writing this material. I would have these notes and then try to project myself into the situation. And I will say this, when I got to the section that dealt with Mulholland's death, I could barely stand to write it because I knew that this book was almost over, and I would not be able to spend time with this guy anymore. I'm not sure if an historian is supposed to say that, but whatever you might want to say about Mulholland, he's an amazing, larger than life figure. And when I realized the extent and the command of his personality, he was just unbelievable to me that no book like this had really been written about him. It was the same thing I've felt about the Flagler story, but even more so. Thanks. Yeah.
1 second. Let me just.
You wrote 2 books about massive projects that were probably like, man-made wonders of the world in the time that they were built. Was it the projects and the technology that were of interest to you, or was it more the people behind those?
Well, that's another good question. If there hadn't been a person at the center of this story, or of the story about the building of the railroad to Key West, I don't think I would have been able to stick with it, because is another thing I tell my students is all stories, good stories, grow out of character. They're character driven. And if it hadn't been for Henry Flagler, that railroad would never have been built. If it had not been for William Mulholland, that aqueduct would never have been constructed. Would there have been a Los Angeles as we know it today? I don't think so. I'm sorry, I just don't think so.
You spent so much time with this and learned so much about it. Do you see any way out for Los Angeles?
Do I see any way out from Los Angeles? Well, people were saying the same thing in 1904. We see no way out for Los Angeles. And I think that someone will come along, like William Mulholland, and will be able to say, desalinization is feasible. It's going to take some time, and there are rough days ahead, but yes, I think we will be able to find a way out of this, just like we've been able to conquer cancer. It's not going to happen overnight. Things don't tend to happen until of this magnitude, until the situation becomes so dire that people say, "Oh, got to spend some money and some effort." We've been, as Jerry Brown said, watering our little green lawns and playing golf for the last 50 years and not paying attention really to that we've been living on capital. I think there's hope. But the next year, how's it going to be? Unless it rains, next year is going to be bad, and the year after could be bad. How long is it going to take to get these desalinization plants up online, producing enough water to make a difference? It may, 50% of the water in California is used by farming and ranching interests. And so the conservation measures announced by Brown don't affect them because they have a lot of economic clout and really don't want it to. Now, rightly so, because you and I have to pay the prices for the beef and the oranges and the tomatoes that are grown there, and they know they don't want to price themselves out of the market, and on and on and on. This is not easy. It's not a them versus us question. But I'm confident that a successor to Mulholland will come along. Were he here, he would say, we've got to get politics out of it to the extent we can, get a waterman in there, let him bring his people on, and then stay out of the way. You guys enforce policy and act laws, but we don't know what to do. You guys tell us what to do. That's the way it was in Mulholland's day. He had the great good fortune to command that kind of respect. We're waiting for the next guy like him to show up. See?
Les, so this is a water system that was built over 100 years ago. How much of Los Angeles's water needs are still supplied by the aqueduct?
Well, until recent years, the Los Angeles aqueduct, until the 1990s, still supplied about 40% of the city's water. It got another 40% or so from the Colorado River, from Boulder Dam, which also was conceived of and designed by Mulholland. He had retired before it began construction shortly after the St. Francis Dam collapsed. And then another 20% from the California Water Project, which comes down from the Central Valley. But the flow, an engineer was telling me today that there's about 17% of Los Angeles water is coming from the aqueduct because there's no snowpack. It's fed by the snowfall in the Sierra Nevadas, and the snowpack is almost non-existent, about 10% of what it is traditionally. I've seen pictures, the ski runs, which would still be covered by snow here in April, you're looking at brown mud. It's sad.
One more question. Let me bring the mic over to you. No, this is for the internet, folks.
Mulholland Drive, as we know it, was that just named after him, or
Oh, yeah.
was the pathway didn't go through that?
The what?
The pathway of the
No,
aqueduct.
no, it has nothing to do with the aqueduct. Mulholland Drive was named as in an honorific way for Mulholland. It was a concept really to open up the Hollywood Hills for development. You couldn't get up there until that road was built. Then it was originally called, I like this kind of stuff, thanks for asking, because it was originally called Mulholland Highway. And it started off in Calabasas and went eastward along the ridge climbed up to the top of the Hollywood Hills, went eastward over to where the Hollywood Bowl is today in the 101, the Hollywood Freeway. That's where it ends. Later on, they did a westward leg of the Mulholland Drive that goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, about 26 miles. And that's even better. It's even more rugged, and the winding roads and the mountains, which Kimberly just dearly loves to be in the car with me when I'm driving through these things, looks like today still looks like California did 100 years ago. Today, that westward little chunk is called Mulholland Highway, and the one that everybody knows from the 405 to the 101 is called Mulholland Drive. And that shot that I showed you, it's like the road down to Key West, one of the most beautiful highways on Earth, for my money, along with Pacific Coast Highway up around Big Sur and Monterey.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And let's give Les Standiford another round of applause. Thank you, Les. I do want to say one last thing. As I told you before, Les is going off on a big tour of Los Angeles and California. And this, as you know, Kimberly makes these marvelous blessing wands. So we will all give our blessing to Les as he travels out west.
I forgot this one thing. When I was out there poking around, looking at this and that, I went to the site of the St. Francis Dam collapse, which is not marked. I mean, you have to look hard to get there. And I fight through this brush, and this is rattlesnake country, mind you. But I finally found where it was, and I see these remnants of what had been. And this is a chunk of concrete that had originally been in the way before that water blew it out. So I
then it collapsed again when he pulled it out.
Yeah. I was out there and I said, maybe one day this book will get finished, and maybe one day I'll be talking to folks, and I'm going to bring along a chunk of this dam. So here it is. You want to take a look? I'll pass it around. Thanks again.
Thank you all. Thank you, Les.
You did a great job.